Okay, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24, brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciella Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies. Please subscribe to the Inclusive Design 24 channel on YouTube. Please hit the subscribe button, and like any of the talks that you've heard so far today, you can also follow ID24Conf on Twitter. And if you have any questions for the presenters, please tweet using the ID24 hashtag, and we'll ask them at the end of the session. Over to you, Adrian.
And a big hello to all of our ID24U participants. We have a few left, which is great, and they're scattered across the country right now. And they are organized meetups for people to hang out and watch the presenters. I'm a big fan of that, of course, but I'm not there. So we have wrapping up, I think this might be the last session for Northern Arizona University Disability Resources in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's also probably the last slot for University of Pacific Center for Teaching and Learning in Stockton, California. And coming online, we have the New York Accessibility Meetup joining us for the first slot of the night. So welcome new people. Thank you all again for joining. And coming up, or rather right now, we have presenting Kathleen McMahon talking about accessibility flavored React components. Kathleen, off to you.
Hello. Here we go. I just had a little tech snafu and I'm going to escape out and reset that. 1 second.
I wasn't looking at my screen or I would have filled more airtime.
No, this was my little issue. What happened was I had a keyboard over here because I love using keyboards. And what happened, this is me filling some space because I like my notes so I can tell you exactly, give some more descriptions on what I'm talking about. And I put that keyboard away because it caused me problems, and we're not going to go through that again. So, take 2. Welcome, everyone. Hello, I'm Kathleen McMahon, and I'm a front-end engineer at O'Reilly Media. I'm here today to talk to you about how you can flavor your React components with accessibility seasonings to make your design system deliciously inclusive. Before we get started, here's an outline of the topics we'll be covering today. First, we'll talk about why accessible components. Then, design systems are a cookbook, design systems in React, and we will go over some patterns for icons, buttons, inputs, headings, talk a little bit about documentation, and we'll do a wrap up. So, why accessible components? Well, we have a wide range of users that access our content, and each of us are differently abled. We have vision users that have low to no vision. Some can't see all colors. Some view a screen in direct sunlight. When you are differently hearing, you could be hard of hearing, or you could be listening in a noisy environment. If you have motor difficulties, you could have a difficulty or inability to use your hands. You may have arthritis, Parkinson's, or you may rely on a keyboard for other reasons. You may have cognitive challenges, like, for example, a developmental or a learning disability. Also, we sense things differently. Some users have migraines. They have vestibular disorders like dizziness, vertigo, or other types of cognitive confusions. We have users that are looking at our content, and there are times when they're looking at content when the language on the page is not that person's native language. Lastly, we can't forget users that are accessing our content in an environment that has low bandwidth. Our users will access our content in many ways and in many media. For example, on desktop, mobile, screen readers, screen magnification software, a mouse, a trackpad, keyboards like a standard or Braille or a Morse code keyboard, which sounds super cool, a straw device, a switch control, and new and fancy voice assistants. So how do we know how to make our content accessible? Well, the W3C has made these guidelines, a set of guidelines called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, called WCAG for short. And they have 3 levels of conformance: single A, double A, and triple A. And just this summer, WCAG level 2.1 has been released, and conformance level double A is the gold standard for inclusive apps. I'm a person that loves the AAA because who doesn't love to achieve? But you can see, go for the best you can get. There are 4 principles of accessibility. Your content has to be perceivable, which means your information and UI components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. Your content needs to be operable. The UI components and navigation must be operable. It needs to be understandable. Information and the operation of the UI must be understandable and robust. The content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. The easiest way to remind yourself of the 4 principles is POUR, which means, for me, pour yourself a coffee. I love coffee. So, over to design system. What is a design system? There is a great InVision blog post that gives a succinct definition. And what they say is a design system is a collection of reusable components guided by clear standards that can be assembled together to build any number of applications. So I would argue that your design system is your cookbook. Now, cookbooks have personality. My mom is a serious fan of cooking, and lately I've been enjoying digging through the cookbooks she's collected over the years to read how recipes evolved over time. If you've ever taken a look at some of the cookbooks published in the 1940s through the 1960s, you will find some serious attention to detail paid to the structure of every single part of the cooking process. For example, here's a quote I ran across in the foreword of the Culinary Arts Institute's encyclopedic cookbook. That was literally 990 pages before the index. And I find this quote relevant to design systems in particular if you're following the cookbook model. And this is the quote: "The personality of a cookbook is as apparent as it is important. It is composed of known and stable ingredients with unknown and elusive ones. And the purpose is to make a mixture of familiar, friendly, and as exhilarating as a pine woods early on a summer morning." So our design system uses React to build our components. So recently, there's been some philosophical debate about using a JavaScript framework to create a product, and relying on JavaScript frameworks potentially causes inaccessible applications. Now, this is the React.js website, and this is their page on accessibility. And if you read the second paragraph, it states, React fully supports building accessible websites, often by using standard HTML techniques. So a better way to think about React is a kitchen utensil. It acts like a kitchen utensil. It is not the only utensil in your kitchen. It's also worth mentioning, it's good to remember that while you have utensils in the kitchen, it is you who wield those tools. You are the cook. In my opinion, it's up to the developer to have that standard HTML, CSS, and JavaScript knowledge and accessibility best practices knowledge to be able to leverage a utensil correctly. And that includes React. So your components. Think of your components as your tried and true recipes. Think of WCAG as your reference material. And before we dive in, I'd like to note that the techniques I'm showing is part of our design system that is currently in beta. We have been making sure that we are prioritizing adding accessibility at the beginning of our product lifecycle and aren't releasing any components into a production environment until they're fully tested. I am thrilled that this is a priority at O'Reilly because it allows us to build quality upfront rather than increasing product life cycles down the line by not considering accessibility first. So creating a component is like following a recipe. So if you've ever looked at any of the recipes, it has a standard format. First, you start with your high quality ingredients. For me, that's semantic HTML. Second, you can mix in some key accessibility seasonings. Sometimes it's ARIA, just a touch of that. Third, you are going to follow the directions. And that's your documentation. And lastly, provide some helpful hints and in your best practices. Now let's dig into the components. And we're going to start with icons. So icons are a great way to add a bit of flourish to your product. They're used to supplement key messaging, identify unique content types, and call attention to areas of importance. Icons can be either informative or decorative. Meaningful icons need alternative text to give context for screen reader users. Decorative icons don't add significant value. And if they are decorative in your app, that text value needs to be hidden from screen readers using the ARIA hidden attribute. So, accessible icon components, the SVGs versus the icon fonts debate. There are a few ways to create accessible icons. Two of the most recent techniques are icon fonts and SVGs. Most notably, you'll hear that SVGs are the new hotness for accessible icons. And yes, it's a great technique. We originally leveraged an SVG sprite sheet in our API for icons, but we ran into a bug in High Sierra that was announcing the sprite's content when we were testing our components in VoiceOver. So we chose to go the icon font route as a temporary solution to maintain the component's accessibility while choosing how we will leverage this SVG technique in a future version of our design system. Let's go over an example of how we make an accessible icon in semantic HTML using the icon font technique. So this is an example of an accessible icon font pattern in HTML. What you see here are two sibling span elements wrapped inside another span. The first span uses a CSS class that leverages the before pseudo element and the content property to display our custom icon font. The second span contains the alternative text that describes the icon. The wrapping span uses a CSS class to convert its display property from inline, which is the native display property of a span element, to inline block. This will help us later on if we want to support adding any margin or padding customization on all four sides of this icon component. Now that the high quality ingredients are in place, it's time to mix in some key accessibility spices. First, we'll sprinkle a pinch of ARIA hidden equals true to the span containing the icon font. This way we can make sure the Unicode characters representing the icon won't read out to screen reader users. Next, we'll add a CSS class to the second span to visually hide the alternative text. This will remove the visual presentation of the alternative text, yet will keep that text exposed to our screen reader users. Lastly, we are adding a sprinkle of the aria hidden equals false attribute to the wrapping container to start prepping the component for how we may expose or hide this component in various scenarios while using React. One thing to note here, adding aria hidden equals false to the wrapper span is not technically necessary in an HTML-based component scenario, since aria hidden equals false essentially has the effect of not being added to the element as an attribute at all. Now that we've taken the time to use our high-quality ingredients and added our accessibility spices, let's see what that markup will look like in a React component. This is what the render function of a React component looks like. The render function provides the instructions for the shape of the component that will be rendered into the DOM. Notice this block of JSX syntax. JSX is a JavaScript extension which is used in React, and this allows us to write JavaScript that looks like HTML, but is compiled into JavaScript, and it creates a virtual representation of the HTML elements that the component will output. When React actually writes these instructions to the DOM, the output of the component is HTML and will look like this. HTML in the DOM. This is a good reason why a thorough knowledge of semantic HTML will benefit you if you're using React as your component implementation tool. Looking back at the React component, this is the block of JSX that will tell React what to render into the DOM. And this is how we can expand that syntax to support props, which are parameters sent into the component by users when they use our components in an app. One thing that you can do with your props is use them to create guardrails in your components to be sure that they're always using the accessibility features you've mixed in. Take, for example, the icon hidden prop. We've declared it at the top of the render function to default to false in case a user doesn't pass in a prop when using a component in the app. This way, we're guaranteeing that this icon will read out to screen readers no matter what, unless the developer purposely specifies otherwise by passing in the icon hidden equals true prop. We assign this prop to the aria hidden attribute of the wrapper component to control whether the icon reads out in your app at runtime. A second guardrail we've set up is a check to see if the icon the developer passes into the component is in our icon library. If the icon doesn't exist in the library, the component doesn't render in the app at all. The third guardrail we've set up here is some support for the icon reading out the icon's default alternative text to the screen reader user, unless the user passes in a custom alternative text value. So if the user doesn't pass in an alternative text value, the default value reads out. If you pass in a custom text value, that value will read out instead when you are looking at this or reading this icon with a screen reader. Here are some helpful hints that you can add to your documentation when you are giving examples to developers how you can implement your icons. This is an example of an informative icon. This is an example of how you can implement a decorative icon. And this is an example of how you can implement a custom text informative icon. Now, buttons. The one thing I want to say about buttons is buttons perform, well, a few things actually. A few things. Buttons perform an action on a page. Buttons should look and act like a button. And buttons should use semantic HTML. because if you use the button element in HTML, you get screen reader and keyboard support for free. A lot of times you will see a dev use the div element. And one of my colleagues, Scott O'Hara, he writes a lot about accessibility. And he has this quote that's a favorite of mine. He said at a recent presentation, he said, use markup with meaning. There is no spec for div. Use it for whatever. So keep that in mind. Let's go over an example of how we can make an accessible button component. First, we start off with the high quality ingredient, the button element, complete with native keyboard interaction support. We also made sure that we're leveraging the hover, focus, and active and disabled pseudo classes in CSS to inform users when they have hovered, focused on the button with either the mouse or keyboard, or are prevented from doing so if the button happens to be disabled. As you can see, we have set focus styles. Very important. This is how your button syntax will look like SJSX. That is the only difference. Instead of class, which is a reserved word in React, you are using class name. We want to support button text with icons, so we can mix in an icon component into this button component. A span element will wrap the icon and the button contents to leverage Flexbox display properties. A lot of times when you place content in a button, first, one, content inside your button should be inline elements, not block elements, because block elements cannot go into a button as contents. That is not valid HTML. Sometimes when you are trying to align contents inside your button in different browsers, results will vary, let's say. So this wrapping span is a good technique to get around that. You can leverage Flexbox display properties, and that way you can properly position your text and icon in cross-browser applications, especially in Safari on iOS version 10.3.3. I ran into that recently. Devs will want the ability to pass in custom text into the button, so we've added a children prop. We've also added on-click handler support and a prop to set the button's attribute to be disabled if need be. The JSX is popped into the component's render method, and we add some props to support this component. Lastly, we're adding a guardrail to ensure that if no icon name is passed in to the component, this whole icon will not render. You will just see the button text. And here are some helpful hints for your button documentation. You could have helpful hints of how to implement your default featured button, a featured button with an icon where your icon is decorative, a featured button where your icon is announced, and a feature button with a custom icon title. What is great about using the custom icon title in this scenario, this button says, click me. And there sometimes will be, say you're on a page, you might have 5 buttons that have the words click me because they're rendered from some sort of function that's mapping over an array. If you're a screen reader user and you're scanning through the page trying to get some context of where you are, and all you're reading for your buttons is click me, click me, click me, you have no idea where you are. What you can do is you can pass in a custom title into your icon title, and this will read out, you could say, click me to go to Bob's email. And you could add an icon title to another button to say, click me to send a form. It gives you better context for the screen reader user. Now over to inputs. Inputs, as a rule, need two things. They need labels and they need error messages. Labeled inputs give all users more context on what the purpose of that input is for. So I have to say this, placeholders are not labels. They are not. You should be avoiding using placeholders instead of labels because your users will lose context. They'll start typing in that input and they will forget what they're typing and have to hit backspace, 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 get all frustrated and not understand what is going on with that form. That's just frustrating. Also, placeholders are hard to style across browsers. Placeholders are also, they aren't auto-translated in your browsers. Make sure that you design your inputs for a max character width of 80 characters, and we're keeping our labels stacked vertically in relation to your input. So you put your labels above and your errors below. The reason why we're doing this is because there are users that will zoom into your screen to at least 200%. And if you have labels not close to your input or not in a place that it's very just close, that user can lose content. So it's nice to have a label above, an error message below. In the middle, you have your input. So if that user is zoomed in at 200%, and if that input is not too wide, that user has maintained context of what that input is for. Also, if you have a group of similar inputs that have the same, they're achieving the same purpose, wrap them in a field set and add a legend to that field set to give the user more context of what this group of inputs is for. So here's an example of how an input is implemented in the render function of the React. Yes, this type is very, very, very small. So I'm going to dive in stages. Let's begin with, this is what a semantic HTML pattern for an accessible label input with a label and error handling should look like. We have a label, we have your input, we have a span that has some label text, we have a div with your error wrapper and a span with your error text. So how we add our accessibility spices into this semantic HTML input pattern is we add a for attribute for the label, and the value of the for attribute is the same value as the ID of the input that you want to associate with this label. Here, the label text is wrapped in a span. There's a reason for this in our pattern because we're using CSS to make this a floating label pattern where the label shows up in the middle. It technically looks like a placeholder, but it's not, because when you focus inside the input, the label will float above and it will stay above there while you're typing, and even after you blur away from the input, you will always see that label. Next, we have some error handling. So there are these items need to be added to your inputs to make sure that your inputs can expose an error message to screen reader users. We have 3 ARIA attributes up here. The first one is ARIA required, which is true. We're assigning it, making sure that this input is required. We're also, here we are just simulating input validation of, we're setting the ARIA invalid attribute to true. This is important for CSS because when this is true, we've set the CSS up to show some different styling around the input and also to display this error message. The third ARIA attribute we've added is the ARIA described by attribute. This attribute allows screen readers to hear the error message, and it designates with this ARIA described by attribute is looking for the message that matches this label, this value. This value is error foo. And if you look down here in our error wrapper, this span has an ID of error foo. So since these match, when this label pops up, your error message will display on the page. And because we added this ARIA live attribute to this span, once the user stops typing in this input field, this wrapper will pop up and the assistive technology will announce to the user, whoops, error. There are two other ARIA live attributes that I'm aware of. I believe it's assertive and rude, and please don't do that for error handling here because that would be disruptive to screen reader users. Keep it polite. So this is that accessible input pattern in JSX syntax. These are the two things that have changed. This and this. So anything that's a class is a renamed class name. And the for attribute that's associated with a label to tie to this ID is renamed HTML4 because the word for in React is a reserved word because for is used in JavaScript. So this is HTML4. And when it renders into the page, it will render again as for. So to reiterate, you can make all of this in HTML and change two things, and you have some JSX syntax. There are a few other things that we've added in here, but I'll go over that in a minute. These are the two things I've added. We've mixed in a disabled attribute support for screen readers and for also sighted users, because if your input is disabled, you cannot click on it, you can't touch it, and you can't interact with it at all. We've also added these two handlers, which is a synthetic event handler. One is called onChange and one is onKeyPress. This is the way that React handles changing values within your components. These two values here are passed in as functions. So what this is doing at this component level is saying when the onChange event happens in React, activate this function, which is being activated at the parent level of an app, not at this child level. This is an interesting React-ism. Here are our guardrails for making an accessible input pattern. We made sure that if the dev does not pass in a label as a prop into your input component, this whole input will not render. So this is a good reminder for developers, add those labels in. Also, excuse me, clicked. If the developer wants to pass in an icon in here and forgets to pass in that icon name, this will not render unless the icon name was passed into the component. Those are our guardrails. These are the guardrails for our error handling. We have two of them. One, if the developer does not set any function to check if the input is invalid, and if the developer also does not pass in the error message, which is down here, this whole component will not render. So here are our helpful hints that we have devised for our inputs. We have some hints for how to implement the default input, and one's for decorative icons, informative icons, invalid inputs, disabled inputs, and that's it. But finally, I'm going to talk about headings. So headings is a good way to separate semantics from presentation. Good heading structure provides an outline of your page. Your headings are intended to introduce each section of your page. That is their intention. A good rule of thumb for headings is to use one H1 per page. That is the most important heading on the page. You shouldn't be doing more than one H1. And you have 6 levels of headings. So, and also screen readers, users rely on heading structure for context. And if a screen reader user is using something like, for me, because I test a lot with it with VoiceOver, you can use the rotor and scan the page for headers and jump right to that content. So proper outlining and structure of page is important. Don't skip or rearrange your heading levels, and be sure that you're separating your heading semantics from the way the visual representation of your headings look like on the page. This is the way I like to think of headings. Heading semantics are like the courses of your meal. So, say you start off with an H1 that describes this, the gist of a dinner. This is what you don't want to do. So you have an H1 that is basically saying the main point of your page. A 4-course meal is the way to go. And then you structure the rest of your page where you want to talk about, you have an H2 that says lamb roast with port wine dinner, an H4 of stuffed deviled lemony eggs, another H4, poached garlic soup, another H4, lamb with port sauce, another H4, Asiago and sage scalloped potatoes, and your last H4 of chart house mud pies. If you have a user that's scanning this page with a screen reader, that user will notice a lack of an H3 and will wonder if they're missing part of their meal. So don't leave your screen reader users hungry. Separate out your heading semantics from that CSS presentation. Here's a way that you can solve that without skipping heading levels. So you can do this instead. Here, you still have an H1 with the same 4-course meal as the way to go. Your H2, you can add classes to each of these. So you have an H1, an H2, an H3, an H4, an H5, another H5, and an H6, which is pretty great. You can, so your meal intro is the 4-course meal. You have a title of what is the meal. It's lamb roast with port wine dinner. This is your section header. And in that section, you can talk about your appetizer, which is your H3, which is your stuffed deviled lemony eggs. And your H4 is your soup course, poached garlic soup. Your H5 is your main dish, lamb with port sauce. And guess what? It's another main dish, which your H5, which is a class of main dish, is Asiago and sage scallop potatoes. And you can finish off with that H6, which is dessert. And that's mud pie. And now I'm hungry. And if you structure your heading structure this way, your look and feel is preserved, and all your users leave the table satisfied. Now, sometimes you need to create a custom component to address scenarios where you need to use that component in different parts of your page. For example, take this card pattern. This card uses a heading among all these other elements. If this is a component you offer in your design system, you should be considering how to adjust the headings level as you implement the component while also maintaining the look and feel of the heading. Earlier this year, I read an article by Hayden Pickering about managing heading levels in design systems, where he introduced a pattern where you could create nested heading levels in a React component. It's a great article, and I used this as a basis to do a more targeted version, namely a component that would allow a dev to separate heading level semantics from presentation in a heading component. Separate heading level semantics from presentation in a heading element. Let's take a look at how it is achieved. We want to go from this in H2. So maybe in one part of the page, you are putting that card component, this card component, in the main section of your page, and maybe in another, maybe in a sub page, you want this same pattern, but in an area that is also headed up by a different, it's already in a hierarchical structure where this should not be an H2, it should be an H3. So we want to change this H2 to an H3, but we want to maintain the class. This is how I did it. We used a ES7 decorator. Basically, what a decorator does is it allows me to, I'm going to talk about this. It's helpful for anything you want to transparency wrapper with extra functionality. You can just look up decorators. I'm still trying to learn how to describe it more clearly. So I'm using this tag decorator, and I'm also going to pass in a heading class here, so we can separate our heading from the class. This is the code. So in the code, there's going to be a lot of guardrails here. So in the code, we have our props that we pass in. We pass in the children, which will be the text that's in your heading. You're going to have a default heading class of an H2. You're also going to have a default heading level as an H2. There's a reason for this. Your tag is basically taking an H and appending on your heading level and resolving it into a string, and that will show up right here. So this heading level is defined by passing in a level, making sure that it is a round number, and also making sure that the developer does not pass in a heading level below 1 and above 6. So this is making sure that your heading level is 1 through 6. You take this, you put it into here, and that renders out as your heading level. Our defaults are a heading level 2 and a heading class of 2, because if the developer forgets to put the levels on the page, you will just, as a default, get an H2. I purposely did not choose a heading level 1 with pairing with a class of H1, because you should be only having one H1 on the page. So this is helping developers to not break that one H1 per page rule, but also when the developer is testing, they can go back in and say, oh, I forgot to pass in that level, pass in a different level here, renders here, and you get your custom header. And by the way, fragments are your friend. This is a new thing in React, where previously in React, prior to React version 16.3, you always had to wrap your JSX in a containing element. And oftentimes you would see a div right here as your wrapper. This was a bad idea in scenarios. Say you're trying to map some table data within, you have some data from an array and you want to populate it into a table data row. And you say you have in here, you have a div right there. And then in here you have like a TD element with, some stuff in there. It's wrapped in a div. You pop this, when you render it, if you pop it into a table, screen readers will not, it breaks your table semantics. So the beauty of a fragment element is just a a wrapping container, but when it renders on the page, this disappears. So all you get is this element here. It's a beautiful thing. It's beautiful for accessibility. Also, some guardrails. If you don't pass any children into your custom tag, you don't get a heading. So this is how you can give some helpful hints on how to do some heading components. This one is your default. If you just pass in heading, it's going to look like an H2. It's going to be an H2 under the hood, and it's going to look like an H2. Here, say you have a heading component, you pass in the level 3, and pass in a heading class of H4, you will get an H3 element, but it will present with H4 styling. This is how you separate your semantics from your styling. So one thing you could always remember, you must be documenting your code, document your examples, and always pay attention to this document. These are your cooking instructions. Dedicate a page to accessibility links, all your favorite articles, all those best practices. Dedicate a page so your team can look up those best practices. And to wrap up, your design system is a cookbook. Your cookbooks have personality. React is like a kitchen utensil, and you are the cook. Your components are your tried and true recipes. You should place helpful hints in every one of your component recipes. WCAG is your reference material, and document, document, document. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was a fantastic talk. Really good practical advice for any React developer. Adrian, do we have any questions for Kathleen?
I have one question hanging out here. For developers who know React but aren't skilled in HTML, how do you guide them to integrate these best practices that you've covered today?
Let me think about that. For me, I am honestly, I go to MDN all the time to learn about the semantics. And then I also go to the W3C, because if you want the encyclopedia of HTML, you go to the W3C. That's how I learn.
I think those are both good resources. I'm a little biased.
Good.
I have one of my own questions.
Okay.
If I may. I have some cookbooks from the 50s or so that rely a lot on floating ingredients and gelatin.
Oh my God, the pictures
Is there
I have.
a React analog to floating ingredients and gelatin?
Is there a React what?
Analog to that.
Floating ingredients in gelatin?
Yeah, just this beautiful Jell-O mold full of buttons.
So we're not talking about we're not talking about garnishes, which is more like like a decorative icons are more like your garnish,
Right. Mine is not really a serious question. It's just an homage to the days of gelatin.
Oh, the pictures I have of these Better Homes and Gardens cookbooks, and some of the verbiage is, I wanted to put pictures in here, I just couldn't justify it. You can see some of it right there in the grayscale, but some of the gelatin, there's some really interesting recipes in there. It's hilarious. I love it.
I'm glad I haven't made any.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Kathleen. Thanks, Adrian, for your questions. Very insightful. So as usual, if you like this session, please hit like and subscribe to the Inclusive Design 24 channel on YouTube. I am very pleased to say, have met our initial target of 600 subscribers. We are just over that now. But it'd be great if we could get higher, see if we can get another few before the end of our day. A reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciella Group, Intopia, and Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies, with thanks to our sponsors DQ. We will be back on the hour in about 10 minutes. with Aaron Gustafsson, who's going to be talking about better performance equaling greater accessibility. Don't miss it. We'll see you very soon.